Good afternoon. I'm Jody. The Violence Against Women Act came into law as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, Public Law 103-322. It was introduced by Senator Joe Biden and Senator Barbara Boxer in 1993 and signed into law in 1994 by Bill Clinton. Congress has reauthorized it 3 times, once in 2005, 2015, and most recently 2013. The background leading up to this law was basically decades of rising crime, specifically against women. And it began around the 60s and just sort of rose steadily from there. In the 1970s, several grassroots organizations formed and to really bring attention to the need for a change in attitude about the mentality of violence against women and to have laws put in place. In the 1980s, the researchers and the public began to see violence against women as a crime instead of simply a private family matter, which it had until that point. So in 1994, Congress passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, and the Violence Against Women Act was part of that. Here are some statistics from the Texas Council on Family Violence. One of the important things I feel is that, 146 women were killed in 2016 alone, and 68% of the perpetrators used a firearm to murder their female partners. And another important thing is that almost 40% of the victims are turned away because there's simply just not enough beds or emergency shelters in place. The Violence Against Women Act of 1994 enhanced investigations and prosecutions against sex offenders and violence against women. It provided funding for several grant programs, and they were all meant to address violence against women from specific angles. So law enforcement, private organizations, service providers, and as well as victims. So some of the penalties were greater for violators who, for example, would cross state lines in order to continue harassing or victimize. And the abusers who took their victims over state lines against their will had greater penalties. It established states and tribal territories to enforce protection orders issued by other states, and it also provided training programs for the Attorney General to help probation officers and parole officers with release of violent sex offenders. It established a new requirement for pretrial detention sex offenders, and it actually also allowed victims to testify in pretrial hearings, and they were able to speak out about how their lives would be in jeopardy if this person were to be let out before their trial hearing. It allowed victims to seek civil cases, which I'll speak about in a few minutes. And it also asked that the Attorney General measure, what all was in place in terms of how to keep the confidentiality of the assault victims. The U.S. Postal Service was required to ensure confidentiality for domestic violence shelters. Pro-arrest policies were encouraged, and I think grants were given in terms of that. And rural states and areas, as well as the tribal governments, were given grants to give money to private entities in rural states in order to provide a more cooperative effort at battling the violence against women. And the third subtitle was what declared violent crimes committed on the basis of gender discrimination, and they said that it was a violation of their civil rights. So an example would just be if someone was performing a violent crime and saying specific statements, hateful statements about women specifically, that would be considered a crime. Just like if a homosexual was beaten to death and that person beating them was saying specific things about homosexuals. And the seventh subtitle was about protections for battered immigrant women, and it was the government recognizing that immigrant women were being abused as well, and they feared to come forward about it because they were afraid of being deported. So they this law allowed them to petition the attorney general on behalf of themselves and their children, and order to not be deported. They just had to prove extreme economic hardship would be a result of that. According to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which was created as part of the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 and is still in use. In 2016, Houston had the second highest number of abuse calls placed to the organization, and Texas is the second country that has the second highest calls in the country. Unfortunately, many people still believe that abuse isn't as serious as that emotional abuse isn't as serious as physical or sexual abuse, but it is, and it can still very much impact a victim's daily life. So the manifest goals of the act was to change attitudes about domestic violence, improve services to victims, and change the way the criminal justice system handled domestic violence and sex crimes. Some of the latent goals were that they were very pro-arrest, and they really wanted to send out the message to society that domestic violence wasn't going to be tolerated anymore. And so as a result, a lot of arrests were made, and which was kind of a problem because women wanted to speak out and stop the abuse, but they didn't necessarily want their boyfriend or husband to be put in jail, probably because oftentimes they were the breadwinner, and just because of the psychological effects of being in an abusive relationship. It also is really intended for victims, but at the time the act was put in place, people were under the belief that men were the perpetrators and not the victims. So you can tell that just from the title of the act and the use of the word woman throughout it. So in 1995, the Office on Violence Against Women was created to administer the grants. It's within the office, the Justice Department. There's two other agencies that collect information, and one's through the Human and Health Service Department, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Office of Justice Programs in the DOJ. Um, so the VAWA categories of crime are domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Those were the distinct crimes that they that they discussed in the original act. In 2000, it was reauthorized through the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act. It basically provided a new program for victims in need of housing, and it added protections for abused foreign nationals and created some programs for the elderly and disabled. In 2005, it was reauthorized as the Violence Against Women and Department of Justice Reauthorization Act. And it basically added some additional protections for trafficked foreigners, and it created the first federal funding for rape crisis centers. Before that, they were just grassroots organizations. And it started to think of services for specific communities. So they created some culturally specific and quote unquote linguistically specific programs. And it also broadened some of the benefits for women with disabilities. So a lot of the problems that weren't addressed in 2005 were the services for the LGBTQ community and so it enhanced ways to combat trafficking, and it gave one important thing was it gave the Indian tribes authority to enforce domestic violence laws against non-Indian individuals. It changed some of its definitions as well, so you can see domestic violence is redefined to include intimate partner violence, and that's how things are usually referred to now. And then it also changed that word linguistically to in the culturally specific grants, and it changed culturally specific services to address some of the other needs, for example, the LGBTQ community. Let's see. So the Violence of Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2018 was what it expired in September of 2018, but they authorized an extension, and it's actually supposed to be that extension is through December 7th. So I think they're going to make some decisions about it Friday. It has some special laws pertaining to firearms. It wants to prohibit people convicted of dating violence from possessing them. And it also wants to enforce firearm surrender policies and address, there's an issue happening with Native American women who have been going missing and also found murdered, and it needs to be addressed. So they're bringing attention to that as well. Thank you so much. Here are my references. And thank you so much. And I'm going to be discussing the Violence Against Women Act as my policy analysis.